This is Beyond the Big Screen podcast with your host, Steve Guerra.
Today we're talking about the movie from 2013, 12 Years a Slave, and we're talking today with James Early, who is the administrator of the American History Fanatics blog and a very popular Facebook group. James is an adjunct professor of history at San Jacinto College in Pasadena, Texas, outside of Houston, and he's published one book and a number of scholarly articles. Along with running the blog and Facebook group, his main areas of research and interest are Eastern European history, the American Civil War, and the Cold War. Thank you so much for coming on today, James.
My pleasure, Steve. I'm excited to be here.
Just to briefly introduce 12 Years a Slave, the movie documents the real-life events of Solomon Northup, a free black man who lived in the mid-1800s New York, who was captured as a fugitive slave on a trip to Washington, D.C. Northup, also sometimes called Northup, and sometimes also called Northup, his freedom and even his identity are stripped from him, and he continually finds himself in harsher and harsher conditions where he has to make even deeper critical moral decisions. Very briefly, the production details. It's based on the book 12 Years a Slave by Solomon Northup. The screenplay is by John Ridley. It's directed by Steve McQueen, a different Steve McQueen, not the Steve McQueen from the 70s. It has a runtime of 134 minutes, and it did very well at the Academy Awards, including Best Picture, Best Supporting Actress, and Best Adapted Screenplay. And it has almost 100% Rotten Tomatoes and Metacritic. The starring character of Solomon, also known as Platt, when he was abducted as a slave, was played by the English actor Chiwetel Ejiofor. One of the slave masters was played by Michael Fassbender. We also have a relatively new actress, Lupita Nyong'o, who plays Patsy, an important slave character and a friend of Solomon. And then we also have Benedict Cumberbatch, who plays William Ford, who is really very important in the book and important in the movie as well. And along the way, we'll get into some of the other characters, particularly Brad Pitt, who, he's a big name star, and he has a very short but critical role in this movie as Canadian Samuel Bass, an itinerant carpenter. James, just looking at this movie, it was based upon an autobiography by Solomon Northup. Tell us a little bit about what was the context of that whole time in 1840s, 1850s America.
Well, sure. The book begins in 1841. As you mentioned, Solomon Northup was a free man. He I believe he was born free, if I remember correctly. His father had been a slave in New York long ago, back when there was slavery in New York. Some people don't realize that you used to have slavery in every state.
Interestingly, it was only about a generation before Solomon that his father was a...
Some of the northern states didn't ban slavery until well into the 1800s, 1820s, 1810s, 20s. But it's interesting because this movie... Maybe I'm going to take this question in a slightly different direction. I don't know, so forgive me if I do. But with this movie being based on a book, there's two kind of major issues at stake in regard to accuracy. Number one, how accurately does the movie reflect what is written in the book? And the short answer is very, very well, very accurately. Not perfect, of course, but very close. Close enough. But then there's another question is... The other question is, how accurate is the book? In other words, did everything in the book 12 Years a Slave actually occur as it is written? Or did the facts get fudged a little? Did it get forced into kind of a standard trope, a standard narrative? because as more and more slaves, whether they were originally free or whether they were born into slavery, as more and more slaves escaped the South, they would oftentimes set up shop in the North, and they would become speakers. And some of them actually wrote narratives of their lives and what it was like to be a slave in the South. Obviously, the most famous example of that is Frederick Douglass, who wrote a famous autobiography of his life as a slave. But there were many others as well by people not as famous as Frederick Douglass, and this is just one of the many. And if you read online, there's some articles where let me say this. Back in the 60s, people began to question a lot of long-held historical ideas, and some scholars questioned the accuracy of the book, saying that, well, first of all, Northup didn't actually write it himself. He was literate, of course. He knew how to read and write, but he dictated it to a white person who wrote down the actual narrative. And the question is, did the person who wrote it down, I forget his name off the top of my head, but did he maybe make some changes to make it fit into what he thought a slave narrative should look like? Did he manipulate it to make it more heart-wrenching, to try to make people more sympathetic towards the slaves? Because the people who wrote these had an agenda. It wasn't just, oh, well, here's my story. Hope you find it interesting. But the people who wrote these stories down were abolitionists for the most part, and their job was to try to get more and more of the North fired up about slavery, fired up in terms of being opposed to it. Because, in the early, we could go all the way back to Jamestown, and I won't do that, but I mean, if we go back to the early 1800s, late 1700s, in the late 1700s when the Republic was founded, most Northerners didn't really care about slavery. Most of them had never even seen a slave or a black person. A lot of people in the North grew up, lived their entire life, and died without ever really having any personal contact with slavery. But the abolitionists who really got going in the 1830s when 1831, William Garrison founded the newspaper, The Liberator, and the movement began to pick up a lot of steam after that. And then these narratives started coming out, which really fanned the fire as well. And so slave narratives became kind of a genre. And there kind of became a standard form for them, if you will, in a way that people expected them to be written. And of course, like I said, their purpose was to get people in the North to start thinking about slavery and to start caring about slavery and to start opposing slavery. And so the question was, how much manipulation was there to Northup's story? Well, over time, the consensus has been not much. In other words, most scholars have come to the conclusion that Northup's account of his life as a slave is actually very accurate. It probably is pretty close to 100% true because he mentions specific people, names, places, and there are actual court records that you can go pull and look up, and they verify everything that he wrote in his book. So I think we can be pretty confident that the movie accurately depicts what's in the book, and the book in turn accurately depicts what actually happened.
One thing coming into this movie, not really knowing much about this specific movie or Solomon Northup's story, is that Black Americans in New York could live a normal life that was not altogether too different than other people. And that I think that's the thing that maybe connects this movie to a modern day audience, is that this person was snatched from a life where he had children and a wife and businesses, a successful member of his community. I believe at the time he was living in Saratoga Springs, which is actually one of my most favorite places in the whole country, let alone in New York State. But so he's living a life, and then he's just wrenched from that life. Maybe we could talk a little bit about fugitive slave hunting and that whole thing, because he was not actually caught in New York. I think that probably would not have happened, or it would have been very difficult for the slavers would have been acting illegally in New York if they had done that. How did Solomon Northup, along with many other free Black Americans, their freedom was stolen from them and put into slavery.
Sure. Well, in the Constitution, there's a clause saying it's called the Fugitive Slave Clause, and there was a Fugitive Slave Act passed not long after that to strengthen it. And it basically is if a slave runs away, let's say from Virginia to New York, the slave owner has the right to send somebody up there or go up himself. Usually they would hire, there were people who worked full time as slave catchers, and the state had to assist in any way they could. The law was strengthened even more in 1850. Everybody's heard probably of the Compromise of 1850. Part of the Compromise of 1850 was a tougher Fugitive Slave Act. And this Slave Act had a lot of measures that were very, very unpopular in the North, especially the upper North. If somebody was, let's say you are living in Saratoga Springs and there's a black person living there, and somebody comes up from the South and says, hey, this is my slave. He ran away. I need your help. In other words, you would have to help. In other words, slave catchers and federal marshals even were involved in some cases, and they could deputize people, and there were penalties for people who obstructed that process. There were penalties for people who assisted fugitive slaves. You could go to jail, you could pay a fine, and the northern states basically passed these laws called personal liberty laws that were designed to frustrate that and to disregard federal law and to make it tougher for people to obey the laws. Now, this story takes place before that second fugitive slave law was passed. It was passed in 1850. 1841 is when Northup was captured. So it didn't start in 1850. You had people who would go up to the north and say, hey, this is my slave. And there was really no legal recourse for the accused. In a lot of states, if not most states, blacks were not allowed to testify in court. They couldn't defend themselves. The word of the white person who accused you of being a slave was just pretty much taken for granted. And what they did was, there's a couple of people who lure Northup down to Washington, D.C., where it was a lot easier there were more slaves there. There were no slaves in Saratoga Springs, New York in 1841. At least I don't think there were. There shouldn't have been. But in Washington, D.C., was a slave. It wasn't a state. It's a city, of course, but it's slavery was legal there. And it was a lot easier to just grab any black person and say, hey, this was a slave. This is my slave, so-and-so. And again, in Northup's case, he couldn't defend himself. He had no legal rights to defend himself.
Northup initially goes to Louisiana, and he winds up at the Ford plantation. All of these people are verified in the historical record, all of the people that he's had interactions with in the movie. Is that correct?
Yeah, I actually, I didn't do this for everybody, but I went to findagrave.com and I found the grave of Edwin Epps. But yeah, they're real people. They're real people that you can go and read about them. They have their own story. You can find their grave and so on.
The very first master, maybe we should talk about how he was processed as a slave.
Oh yeah, I didn't exactly finish that. I'm sorry. Northup was kind of a jack of all trades. Northup made his living by doing physical labor. He was a carpenter, but he also was an excellent violinist or fiddler, I guess we would say. He played the fiddle, and he made a lot of money by entertaining people at different parties and things like that. So a couple of people came up to him and said, we would like you to play in our circus, but we need you to come to Washington, D.C. And they used flattery to kind of win him over. And so he followed them and he went down to D.C. and they took him to dinner one night, and he was having dinner with them, and he started getting sick. And he basically, I don't know if he was drunk. It doesn't really make that clear, or maybe they put something in his wine to kind of not really poison him, but to make him sick. That's probably what happened. and Northup gets sick, and the next thing he knows, he wakes up and he's chained in a slave pen. He's basically like a jail, for it was a place where they kept slaves before they moved them down to the deep south. And somebody comes in, and Northup, being a free man, of course, demands to be let go. He says, I'm a free man, I'm from New York, and their response is just to beat him. They just beat the living daylights out of him until he finally stops saying he is a free man. The man who caught him was named Theophilus Freeman, and he's actually a real, like everybody in the movie, at least most of the people, he's a real person. He was a notorious slave trader. I've read about him in other books. He would buy slaves in the Upper South, because what was going on at this time is the Upper South was, like, when I say Upper South, I'm sure what most people know what I mean, but I'm talking about places like Virginia, North Carolina, Tennessee. In the Upper South, they were starting to move away from cash crop dependence. So they were moving away from tobacco and cotton and diversifying some more. So they didn't have as great of a need for slaves. So a lot of the slave owners in the Upper South were selling their slaves to these brokers, I guess you could call them, for lack of a better word, people who bought slaves and then resold them in the Deep South, where there was more of a demand for slave labor because cotton was still dominant. And so that's the system, or the process, that Northup was drafted into, for lack of a better word. He was sent on a boat down to a cotton plantation in Louisiana, in the Red River area.
His first master is a man named William Ford, played by Benedict Cumberbatch in the movie. He is portrayed as a somewhat enlightened slave master of the time. Was there such a thing, and was William Ford known as that way? Was he portrayed that way in the book?
Yeah, the answer to both of those questions is yes. Most movies about slavery or miniseries, like you look at the movie Roots, for example, it was a miniseries famous back in the 70s, redone recently. They tend to focus on the crueler masters, and there were plenty of those. But there were also masters who were more benevolent and who did not just constantly beat and whip their slaves and rape the women and all that. And William Ford was one of those. Let me, if I may, I'm going to read a passage straight from the book. And this is what Northup himself writing. He wrote his book after he was freed, obviously, after he was able to go back to the North. He says, "It is but simple justice to him when I say, in my opinion, there never was a more kind, noble, candid, Christian man than William Ford. The influences and associations that had always surrounded him blinded him to the inherent wrong at the bottom of the system of slavery. He never doubted the moral right of one man holding another in subjection. Looking through the same medium with his fathers before him, he saw things in the same light. Brought up under other circumstances and other influences, his notions would undoubtedly have been different. Nevertheless, he was a model master, walking uprightly according to the light of his understanding, and fortunate was the slave who came to his possession. Were all men such as he, slavery would be deprived of more than half of its bitterness." So what he's saying is that Ford was a very good man. And if someone were to respond and say, well, but yeah, he can't have been that good because he was holding slaves, Northup's response is basically, well, that's the way he was brought up, and he never really had any reason to question it. He was a product of the system, so to speak. And I like what he says at the end. If all masters were like Ford, slavery would have lost half of its bitterness. It's interesting how he says half. I mean, you still would have the horrible injustice of the fact that one man is holding another as property, but at least you wouldn't have a bunch of, all these whippings and beatings and lynchings and all that actually happened.
There's a somewhat complex situation and set of scenes after Northup initially comes to the Ford farm. Ford really likes Solomon, and they get together well, but that sort of antagonizes Solomon to some of the other employees of the slave master Ford. And now, a brief word from our sponsors.
Yeah, in particular, one of the white people that worked for William Ford, which I thought his portrayal by Benedict Cumberbatch was really, really good. I love Cumberbatch. I'm a big Sherlock fan, and But anyway, there was in particular there was one fellow named Tibbets, John Tibbets. John Tibbets was a carpenter who worked for Ford, and Tibbets was basically jealous of Solomon, because there was one scene, and this is completely straight out of the book, where Ford was shipping a lot of his materials by carriage, or I don't know. They were in a very rural area of Louisiana where there weren't good roads, and so to get their product to market, the cotton or whatever else it was they were growing there, they had to go on these horrible roads and go way out of the way. But they were right by a creek, a pretty wide creek, which is 12 feet wide at the minimum. Solomon had actually worked when he was younger on one of the canals and around the New York-Canada border. I forget which.
I think one off of Lake Champlain.
Yeah, that's your neck of the woods. I've never been up there. I'm a Southern boy myself, but anyway, and so Northup says to William Ford, well, why don't we float the products down the river? We can make some rafts, and we can cut the time way down, and that'll cut the cost of transport down. And Ford says, yeah, heck yeah, let's give it a shot, and it works. And so Northup becomes a hero, and Ford says to him, where did you learn this? And he said, well, I worked on the canals up in New York, and that makes Tibbets kind of look like a dummy by comparison. And so I think Tibbets is very, very jealous of Ford as a result, and it makes him become very, very cruel. He was probably a cruel man anyway, but so it ends up, if I can go on to the next thing, it ends up causing a kind of a feud between Tibbets and Solomon. We'll just call him Solomon. They're calling him Platt the slave by now, but we'll call him Solomon. So Solomon is ordered by Tibbets to build this kind of like a shack, a small building, a shed, if you will, and he's building it, and he's doing what he was told. But Tibbets says, "No, you didn't do what I told you," and he says, "Go get this one type of nails," and Solomon does it exactly like he says, and Tibbets said, "No, you didn't," and basically Tibbets orders Solomon to strip off his shirt because he's going to whip him. And Solomon says, "No, I will not do that." And so Tibbets comes and starts to physically attack him with a whip. And Solomon is actually a much stronger man. And he overcomes him, and he ends up whipping Tibbets. So the slave is whipping one of the masters rather than the other way around. And that leads to major problems.
Which one of the problems is really Tibbets's problem, is that he attempts to hang Solomon, but in hanging Solomon, he's endangering a piece of William Ford's an expensive part of his operation.
Yeah, that one thing I don't think people today quite understand, even people who have some understanding of our early history, how much a slave costs. You and I talked about this offline a few days ago, that a good field hand could go for $1,000, $1,500 in that day's money, which I think I calculated was about like $1,500 in 1850 is about $45,000 in today's money. So yeah, it's kind of funny. There's this one scene early on. We skipped over this, but there's a scene where they're on the boat. After Solomon has been captured and they're on the boat going to Louisiana, Solomon and a couple other slaves devise a plot to take over the boat so that they can escape. And one of the other slaves, who's one of the co-conspirators, he tries to protect one of the slave women from being raped, and he gets stabbed to death and dies, and that ends the plot, because now there's only two people against a crew of about 6 or 7 or 8. That did not happen in the book. In the book, the slave who is stabbed in the movie, he does die, but he actually dies of smallpox. That's not nearly as exciting as being chivalrous and trying to protect a woman's honor and being stabbed to death. But the guy would not have stabbed a slave. He was like the UPS man delivering the package, right? A UPS guy would not take a package out and destroy it, especially one that expensive. He would have been seriously disciplined. So that was a little bit ridiculous, but yeah. And the idea that Tibiets, and this is actually true. The real Tibiets really did attempt to hang Solomon because he was just so incensed, so enraged about the fact that not only did Solomon refuse to obey orders, but Solomon actually delivers him a whipping, literally whips him. One thing that's not completely clear in the book is at that point, Tibiets was actually the owner of Solomon. William Ford sold Solomon as a cost-cutting measure to Tibiets. And although William Ford maintained the mortgage or the lien, so it's kind of like, when you buy a car or a house, you're the owner, but you're really not the owner. The bank is the owner. They're just letting you have it until you pay back, and then you become the owner. So that's kind of what it was. Tibiets it was his first slave, and he bought Solomon on credit. And so had he killed Solomon, then that would be like if you bought a car and you owned, let's say you still owed $20,000 on it, and you destroyed the car. Well, the bank is not going to be very happy about that. So that's how Solomon gets rescued. The overseer of the plantation, who worked directly for Ford, stops it. And I was just reading up on this before our interview. He literally pulls a gun on Tibiets and the two, goofballs that he had helping him out, and threatens them with their lives. And they run away. That would have been, he says basically, hey, Robert Ford is the real owner. I mean, you're the owner, yes, technically, but Robert Ford has a $450 mortgage on this slave, and you cannot destroy that.
That's the thing that kept coming up from scene by scene with this movie, is how much of the finance and this movie really digs into these nitty gritty details of slavery that makes it even more of a disturbing and disgusting institution, that it's so ingrained and so deep into the society.
Oh, absolutely. People don't understand that slavery was big business. The total amount of capital invested in slaves in the South, and I forget the number, but it was billions of dollars in that day's money. I think it was like $3 or $4 billion.
Oh, wow.
So, who knows what that would be today? I mean, you multiply it by 30 or something. So we're talking $90 billion, $100 billion tied up in slaves. I mean, when the slaves were freed, that just basically cut a huge piece out of the Southern economy. It's just staggering to think of it. You read the numbers and you think, God, how could that even be possible? But it's true.
Movie was a little unclear about how exactly Solomon was sold to the new owner, Edwin Epps, especially since there was some complications on who actually was his owner. How does the account of how the movie portrayed it line up with Solomon Northup's account in his book?
Well, it's pretty much the same, except for, like I told you, that technically the owner was Tibiets at the time he was sold. Although, like I said, Ford was the actual owner in terms of the finances. He just basically had, I guess you could say, Tibiets had taken out a loan or a lien. But the reason that Ford sold Solomon, he didn't want to. He liked him a lot, and he was making him a lot of money. But just once Solomon, everybody knew that Solomon had beaten up Tibiets. News travels fast in a small town, as they say. And there was another conflict too that's not even mentioned in the movie. In the book, there's a second time when there's a fist fight or a physical fight between Tibiets and Solomon, and Solomon defeats him again, and Solomon actually runs away for a while, but then he realizes he can't feed himself, so he comes back to Ford. But that illustrates something that was very common. When a slave developed a reputation as being, to use the term they used at the time was uppity, okay? But when a slave was seen as being rebellious, when a slave had tried to run away, or when they had rebelled against their master, as Solomon did, that drove down their price. And it made them hard to sell, because it's hard to put ourselves in this position, but if you were a slave owner and you were trying to buy another slave, would you want to buy one who had been running away or rebelling? You wouldn't. And so in the movie, Ford says to Northup, or Solomon, he says, the only person that would take you was Edwin Epps. He said, I can't keep you here because you're not going to be safe. In the movie, the motivation is that Ford liked Northup, and he didn't want him to, he was afraid Tibbetts was going to kill him, sneak up in the middle of the night and have a lynch mob or something. And he didn't think he could keep Northup safe, so he had to sell him to somebody far away. And as I mentioned, Epps was the only person that would take him. It's pretty much what happened in the book, too. So in other words, it was kind of, it was more, I don't know, it may not have been quite this way in reality, but the movie portrays as more of a philanthropic thing. In other words, Ford sells Solomon for his own good to keep him safe because he couldn't guarantee his safety.
Edwin Epps seemed to be a fairly typical farmer of that time. He had a big plantation, but he wasn't a yeoman farmer by any stretch of the imagination. He did a lot of the work, and he seemed heavily involved with the works. And he didn't strike me as maybe as wealthy as other farmers. What do we know about the real Edwin Epps?
The real Edwin Epps was somebody who had risen up through the ranks. He was originally just a farm worker himself, and he had done well and been able to get his own plantation. He wasn't one of these ones that was born into it, like I think William Ford was. And that's interesting because I read a fascinating book in grad school called Soul by Soul, and it focused on the slave market. And one of the arguments the author makes, and in fact, I assigned this to my students later when I started teaching college history. It's a little bit deep for undergraduates, so I've kind of backed off on using it, but it's a wonderful book. And one of the arguments the author makes is that if you wanted to be anybody in Southern society, you had to own slaves. In other words, slave owners looked down upon whites that did not have slaves. They saw them as white trash, poor whites. And so buying a slave for a white farmer was a way of announcing that you've arrived. Even if you just had one, you were really moving up on the social ladder. And then, of course, you tried to get two and you tried to get three. And the more, you kind of like today, some people think, if you have a bigger house, you have more cars, then you're higher class or whatever. Back then, it was measured in terms of slaves. Houses, too, of course, but slaves. So if you had 50 slaves, you were better than somebody who had 20 slaves, for example. So people like Tibbetts and Epps were trying to move up in society. Obviously, Epps was way ahead of Tibbetts because Epps had probably, half a dozen or maybe a dozen slaves.
Epps was portrayed by Michael Fassbender. And one of the things that really grabbed me is how everyone was always hot and sweating. I mean, they're in Louisiana. I felt like the filmmakers really, that is an area that they really grabbed a slice of life, was how miserable the people were, how hot and how hard that the slaves worked.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, it was, I don't know, with all due respect to global warming, I imagine it was almost as hot back then as it is now, if not as hot, and there's no AC. I mean, I personally hate being hot. I mean, I keep my house really cold, so I've lived in Texas all my life, but that doesn't mean I like the heat. So yeah, imagine living in that kind of that heat and that humidity with no air conditioning. And now they designed their houses in such a way that they were more conducive to breezes flowing through. But I'm here to tell you, as a guy that grew up in Houston, Texas, that sometimes the breezes in summer are more like being in the middle of like you're standing in front of a hairdryer. It doesn't really help a whole heck of a lot. But yeah, people, it's hard for us to imagine sitting in our air-conditioned homes and cars and offices, how just miserable even the richest people, how miserable you would have been all the time. And then the slaves, the work was absolutely backbreaking. They would be out there at dawn, sometimes even before dawn. They'd be out until way late at night, at sunset at the absolute earliest. And sometimes if there was a full moon, they would work even later. And then they had to go home and do the chores. Their day didn't end when they finished picking cotton or cutting sugar cane or whatever it was they were doing. They had to, milk cows and clean things, and they had to eat their own dinner. And so they probably weren't getting to bed till maybe midnight, 11 o'clock midnight on average. And then they had to get up at the crack of dawn the next day. It's just, that's one of the great strengths of this movie. Just kind of piggybacking on what you just said, is how it depicts the absolute brutality of slavery. And I'm not talking about just the whippings and the beatings, which those were bad enough, but just the fact that even if you never got whipped in your entire life, and that would be a rare slave, but you were absolutely working yourself into the grave. And that's why, most slaves didn't really live a whole long time. They show one slave, his name is Uncle Abram, who basically just drops dead out in the field, and they show his funeral. And I think that's a really powerful scene as well.
Another aspect of the life that people lived on the plantation was how involved Edwin Epps was in everyone's life. He had a particular relationship with one of the slaves, Patsy, and he was really involved with each one of their lives. I thought kind of put him as a psychotic father. He was just in everyone's business, and just his cruelty was immense in the movie. And it was personal, too. It wasn't a cruelty from a distance that telling somebody else to do a whipping. There was a scene about that we can discuss later. But he was involved with every aspect of the administration of that plantation. Yeah,
absolutely. We discussed this earlier offline, and that the whole plantation, black and white, was like a big family. And of course, the whites all saw themselves as superior to the blacks. I mean, that was true even in the North. But in the South, on these plantations, almost every aspect of a slave's life was controlled by the master. And you couldn't even, for example, you had to have the master's approval to marry somebody. And so, yeah, and oftentimes there was a lot of interaction. And a lot of times the master it was usually the case of a male master would take a fancy to one or more of the female slaves, and they would have relationships. I mean, that there's so many instances of that in our history. If you think about Thomas Jefferson, who took one of his slaves as basically a housekeeper, but a live-in lover, common law wife, we would say today. But he had many descendants, or many children who now have many descendants by his mistress / slave, Sally Hemings. And in this case, it was Edwin Epps really loved this slave named Patsy, but he kind of had a love-hate relationship with her, mainly love. She was very good at picking cotton. She was the best by far. She had really nimble hands and could pick 500 pounds of cotton a day, whereas a good man would do 200, 250. And as a result of that, the wife of Edwin Epps, Mrs. Epps, I forget her first name off the top of my head, but she absolutely detested Patsy and was always trying to get Edwin to sell her. And what's interesting is, as cruel as the movie depicts Edwin Epps and his wife as being, the book actually makes them even more cruel, basically. It's like the movie kind of lightened up a little. The book talks about how Epps would just go around and start whipping slaves for no reason, just for fun. And Mrs. Epps would just throw things at Patsy just because she was jealous of Patsy. She would throw bottles and things like that. There was one instance in the movie where that happens, but I think the movie actually kind of cleaned it up a little bit, as bad as it is.
Into the movie, there's a scene where Solomon has an abortive opportunity to try and gain his freedom. Edwin Epps brings on a free white laborer who's essentially doing the same labor as the slaves, but he's getting paid some amount of money to do it. First off, how common was that laborers would be brought on? I mean, that sort of seems to defeat the whole purpose of the slavery system.
Yeah, I think it was pretty rare. You didn't see a whole lot of that, but that just shows how there was such a demand for labor. The cotton industry really took off, really starting in the early 1800s, and it spread to the lower South by the 1820s, 1830s, 40s, and it was just, you couldn't get enough people to pick cotton. It was just, they needed laborers big time, and slaves were expensive. Once you paid for them, their labor was free, but they would die, they would run away occasionally, so you couldn't always fill the demand for labor with slaves. So they would occasionally have to hire some white people. This particular guy in the movie was somebody apparently who had been and he is straight out of the book. He had been an overseer on a plantation, which an overseer, I'm sure most people know what that is, but it's basically somebody who supervises and makes sure the slaves are working. The master himself didn't usually go out and do that. But anyway, this man had been an overseer and he had fallen on hard times. He was a little bit too enamored with the bottle and had lost his position and ended up being just a common laborer. And as you mentioned, Solomon tries to get him to help him. Solomon had actually earned some money. That's another thing people don't know is sometimes slaves actually were allowed to earn money, particularly if you were a craftsman, blacksmith, let's say, carpenter. In Solomon's case, he was a very good violinist or fiddler. So Solomon would go and play at parties, as we mentioned a long time ago. He did that when he was free. He also did it as a slave, and people would give him money and he would keep it. And so he gives this man, this white farm laborer, he gives him pretty much all the money he had and gives him a letter to deliver and hopefully get it eventually to some of his friends back in New York and let them know that he's been captured and hopefully get himself rescued. But the guy double crosses him and tells Epps about it. And what's really interesting is that Solomon was really smart, and Epps confronts him about it, and he says, "Hey, did you do this?" And Solomon says, "Oh no, it's a lie. This guy's just trying to get back to being an overseer, and he's just trying to get you over on his side." And I wouldn't believe him. And Epps goes, "Oh yeah, okay, that makes sense." So Solomon really dodges a bullet there by using his own wits.
And now, a brief word from our sponsors. There was an interesting scene where Patsy is visiting with another plantation with Mistress Shaw. What was that from the book, and what exactly was that portraying?
It is partly from the book, partly in that there was a Mistress Shaw. This was pretty rare, but occasionally let's say a white plantation owner, his wife would die, and he might actually marry a former slave. We talked about earlier how there were a lot of physical relationships between masters and their slaves, and occasionally, more often than not, it would be an unofficial relationship like we talked about Jefferson having with Sally Hemings. But in this case, apparently, I guess this was before there were laws about this, but he actually marries, or I don't know if he marries her officially, but he makes her the woman of the house. So that was historical, and that's in the book. But the part about Patsy going over there and sitting down and having tea with Mr. Shaw, that was a complete fabrication. That was just for dramatic effect.
As we move a little bit later into the movie, this is the point where we get to that Canadian itinerant carpenter is brought in named Bass, who is played by Brad Pitt. And throughout the next several scenes, Brad Pitt, Bass, and Solomon have different conversations, and it's finally that Solomon feels that he can proposition Bass to work on his cause and maybe write some letters. What was the story with that?
Well, as you could imagine, after Solomon was double-crossed by the farm laborer, he was a little bit more reluctant to trust anybody. But lo and behold, this guy Bass shows up, Samuel Bass, who was actually originally, as you mentioned, from Canada, but he was kind of a vagabond. Maybe that's the wrong word, but he was a wandering carpenter who would go from place to place and do some work and make some money and then kind of move on. Bass shows up, and he and Northup end up working on the same building. They're building a house or some kind of building. It doesn't really say what, but so they're working together, doing carpentry work, and Bass gets to talking, and Epps will come over there from time to time and talk with Bass, and Bass is an abolitionist. I mean, he is a hardcore anti-slavery guy, and he is not afraid to speak his mind to Edwin Epps. And they get into these long discussions. And these discussions, I must say, are almost word for word out of the book. In some cases, they are literally verbatim from the book. And Epps just thinks Bass is a nutcase. Bass will say things like, well, how do you get off? Who gave you the right to own another human being? And Epps is kind of simple-minded. He says, well, I bought him. And Bass kind of says, no, that's not what I mean. I mean, why are you able to buy him? I mean, who's to say in another situation you might not be a slave? And so Northup is able to witness how opposed to slavery and just what a good man Bass is. And so he basically decides to trust him, and he takes another crack at getting somebody to deliver some letters to the North. And this time it works out because Bass does want to help him. In fact, Bass helps him even more in the book than is portrayed in the movie. The movie, just for sake of time, doesn't show everything that Bass does, but Bass is able to get some letters back eventually to Saratoga Springs, to some of Northup's friends that he had known up there. And there's a lot of fear in the book that's not necessarily portrayed in the movie, that it takes a long time. Time passes and it passes and it passes, and Bass goes away and Bass never comes back. And he finally eventually does come back, and months go by, and Bass just tells him, hey, be patient. These things take time. I'll go back again. I'll deliver more letters. I'll meet with people in person. And so, but yeah, the movie compresses that for the sake of time. But when you read the book, it's very suspenseful. If you didn't know the outcome, you'd be thinking, oh my gosh, is this really going to work out or not?
Solomon eventually does become freed. One of his friends from Saratoga Springs, there is a scene where he comes with the local county sheriff and they have a confrontation with Edwin Epps. I just wondered, how was that treated in the book? And then also, how is that, what would the legal process have been for that sort of engagement?
Well, I'm not an expert on the legal process, but basically, if there were enough witnesses who could testify that Solomon's story was true, that he was a free man who had been captured into slavery, they did have records, they had papers that could prove it, court documents, real estate documents, things like that, proof that there was really a Solomon Northup who had been living in Saratoga Springs and then had disappeared. Of course, Solomon couldn't prove the fact that he was kidnapped and sent into the South, because obviously there were no papers saying that. Nobody was going to write that down. But there were enough documents proving that he had actually, in fact, and the question was that Edwin Epps was able to raise is, well, this is not, how do you know this is not Solomon Northup? This is Platt. He's a slave. But the fact that you had a witness who came down from the North who was able to testify, no, this really is Solomon Northup, a free black man who used to live in the North, that's what really made the difference.
Wasn't his friend from the North able to convince Epps to give up his claim? Because I would have to imagine that Epps, even at that time, would have had recourse to go to courts, and there would have been, if he wanted to hold up the situation and Solomon's freedom, that he could have.
Yeah, it's interesting that in the book there are actually, in the appendix to the book, there's a bunch of legal documents that he had some friends in high places. He had some white friends who had connections in the government in New York, and they were able to help him as well. And as I mentioned, there's documents that actually even the governor of New York got involved with this. So I don't think Epps was kind of outgunned legally. Yeah, I mean, he didn't have a governor and other political people on his side.
The movie ends with Solomon's reunion with his family at home. How did the movie portray his family?
It was pretty accurate. They lopped off one kid, which I don't really know why they did that. Did they not have enough money to pay another actor? I don't know. But Solomon, in fact, had 3 children, not just 2. And in the book, it says that the youngest daughter, in the book there were 2 daughters. The youngest one didn't even recognize him, because didn't remember him because it had been so long. She was really, really little when he disappeared, and so didn't remember him. But yeah, it's a touching scene, kind of I don't know if you want to say happy ending when there was so much tragedy in the movie, but at least he went back and his wife was still there waiting for him. She stayed faithful, never remarried, even though she had absolutely no clue what happened to him. His oldest daughter had gotten married and they had a child, and then the son, of course, he was 12 years older as well. They were all 12 years older. Imagine that. But it's really touching, and it's very accurate to the book, except for the one child difference.
What happened to Solomon Northup at the end of his life? He, at least by Wikipedia, they don't know exactly when he died. Is there much about what his postscript is?
Nobody will never know for sure. Before I answer that, though, let me go off and let me get on a soapbox real quick, if I can.
Sure.
One thing that bugs me about this movie and other, like there's a movie called The Birth of a Nation. You and I have discussed it before. Not the 1915 racist KKK propaganda piece, but the 2016 movie about the Nat Turner Rebellion, which was actually in 1831. That movie and this movie make one major blunder, and that is too many beards.
Oh.
Now, don't get me wrong. I'm a big fan of beards. I love beards. You know that. I wear a beard. But this movie starts out in 1841. And you look around, and 50% of the men have a beard. That's not accurate. Beards did not really come into fashion until the mid-1850s. I mean, you think about Abraham Lincoln didn't grow his until 1860. He's just one example of many. I have almost never seen any official any portraits or photographs. Obviously, you didn't have photography until a little. You had daguerreotypes, but you didn't have real photographs until the late 1840s or so. But look at photographs of people in the 1830s and 40s and even early 50s. You will not see hardly any beards. Maybe an occasional town drunk or a mountain man or something. But I mean, you look at this movie. Bass has a beard. Edwin Epps has a beard. The two guys that captured Northup have a beard. Paul Giamatti's character, the name is Theophilus Freeman. He has a beard. There's just beards everywhere. And it's even, and the same thing in Birth of a Nation from 1831. So I don't know why they do that. But come on, guys, get it right.
Two things came to my mind with that beard situation. One is beards making people look old-timey. But also, I'd be wondering if you tracked the popularity of beards when the movies are made.
That's a good insight, Steve. I think you're really onto something. I had the same thought even as I was giving my diatribe just a minute ago. Yeah, if you look at movies that are set in the mid-1800s, before the Civil War, let's say between 1830 and 1850, 1860, that were made in the 1940s, 50s, 60s, you won't see a whole heck of a lot of beards. Beards are probably underrepresented in those movies, but then nowadays, now that beards are fairly popular, a lot of guys wear beards. They're coming back in the movies. So I think you're totally onto something. I mean, everybody knows that when you read a history book or a novel or when you watch a movie, it tells you as much about the time period in which it was written or filmed as it does the time period that it's about. All right? Movies reflect. Let me give you an example. We were talking about the movie Lincoln a while back. Thaddeus Stevens is a good guy in the movie Lincoln. Okay, the radical Republican leader. He's a guy that helped. He wanted equality for the blacks, and that is a good thing. That is cool now. I mean, that's popular. But there was a movie made in the 1840s called Tennessee Johnson. And it was about Andrew Johnson and Reconstruction, and that was in a time when America was still in Jim Crow. It was before the civil rights movement really took off. And Thaddeus Stevens is a bad guy in that one. I think Thaddeus Stevens may be in the 1915 Birth of a Nation too, or he was in some other movie I was reading about in which he was a bad guy. So again, whether or not was Thaddeus Stevens a good guy or a bad guy? Well, it depends on what the people of the time think, in which the movie is set or the book is set.
Yeah, stories can be very easily manipulated.
Absolutely. And again, they reflect the culture of the time in which they were written or filmed as much as they do the time period. But let me get back to your question. What was the question? I forgot.
Solomon's later life. They don't say much at the end of the movie.
If I could just tell a little funny story real quick. When I went to University of Texas in Austin, and they used to have this thing called Lunch with the Coach. And the football coach, and it was almost like an informal press conference. Anybody could show up and ask him a question, and people would ask him a question. One time he gave this really long-winded answer, and he says, "Well, I don't remember what the question was, but that's the answer." So that's kind of the way I've been. But there were theories that Northup maybe got recaptured and sent back into slavery. There were theories that he was killed, like maybe somebody, Epps or somebody else, sent somebody up to kill him. There was even a cockamamie theory. I say cockamamie in my opinion. There was a theory that this entire thing was a scam. Like Solomon Northup went in with these two guys that captured him, Hamilton and obviously not Alexander Hamilton, but Abram Hamilton, and what was the other guy's name? I'm trying to pull it up. Well, it doesn't matter. But the two guys who supposedly kidnapped Northup and ended up selling him to Theophilus Freeman, that was all like a scam to make money, and that Northup was supposedly only going to go down for a little while, and then they were going to get him out, and they would pocket the money. That is insane. I mean, that's absolutely...
That seems like a very large stretch.
Nuts. But in the end, we just have to admit we don't know what happened to him. There's no grave that anybody knows about. There's no tombstone. People have been trying to find it and just no luck. And that just shows us how sometimes people just really do disappear. We don't know what happened. I mean, they don't literally disappear, of course, but they disappear to us.
Well, I think this was a really great movie. What is your final takeaway to this movie?
Well, I love the movie because it shows just how ugly our history is at times. I mean, when I teach American history at the beginning of each semester, I tell people, get ready because there's a lot of ugliness. There's slavery, there's injustice against women, minorities, there's war, there's famine, there's disease, there's just all kinds of just ugliness. But I think what the movie shows, one of the themes of the movie is that in spite of the ugliness that you may have in your life, all of us go through struggles, and not very many of us go through the kind of struggle that Solomon did. But you never give up hope. There's a scene that I think purposely illustrates it, and there was when Solomon was first captured and forced into slavery, he was together with several other people in a similar situation. And one of them was a lady named Eliza. And Eliza was sold to William Ford along with Solomon Northup. And Eliza, they show her just crying and crying and crying because her children were sold to other masters. And a lot of families were broken up, and Eliza's was no exception. And Solomon confronts her, and he basically tells her, stop crying. Don't let your grief, I can't remember the exact quote, but it's a great quote. Do not let your grief consume you or it will bury you. And she basically tells him, hey, do you understand what it's like to be separated from your family? Have you been through what I've been through? And he says, yes, actually I can. But he says, I choose to persevere. I will dedicate my resources to Master Ford until such a time as I am able to become free. So despite all the horror, despite the utter helplessness of the situation that Northup was put into, he never gave up hope. He never gave up, and he did what he had to do to survive. That's another theme that we see. He says, I survive. He says that a couple times in the movie until such a time as he's able to better his situation. So I think that's the takeaway. Even though, well, first of all, U.S. history is ugly, but in the end, it generally tends to come out okay. But and also on a personal level, no matter what we're going through, we need to persevere and survive because things are likely, or at least it's possible that they will get better.
Thank you for listening to Beyond the Big Screen podcast. Of course, a huge thanks goes out to our second-time guest, Professor James Early of the American History Fanatics blog and Facebook group today as well. Links to learn more about James Early, as well as his blog and Facebook group, can be found at americanhistoryfanatics.blogspot.com by searching for American History Fanatics on Facebook or in the show notes. If you would like to learn more about Beyond the Big Screen, see show notes, and connect to social media, go over to a2zhistorypage.com. I would love to hear your questions, comments, and feedback. We can talk movies, and I would definitely like to hear your idea for future episode topics or interesting guests. The email address is steve@a2zhistorypage.com. If you like what you hear, I would really appreciate you leaving the show a rating and review on iTunes. Ratings and reviews really help me a great deal to let me know what you think about the show and make the show better. So with that, we will see you next time beyond the big screen.